You boys ever wonder why some old jackets are worth more than the people laughing at them? The question drifted across the surplus store in a calm, weathered voice that barely rose above the hum of fluorescent lights, yet it lingered in the air long after the laughter had started. 3 young men stood near the entrance with their phones raised, grinning at each other, as though they had just discovered the funniest thing in town. One of them nudged the oldest man in the room with an elbow, careful enough to avoid real contact but eager enough to earn another laugh from his friends. Arthur Bennett never looked at them. At 84 years old, he stood quietly beside a rack of faded military field jackets, his hands resting lightly on the sleeves of an olive-drab M65 that had clearly lived a longer life than anyone inside the building except its owner. The jacket carried years in every thread. The cuffs were softened by time. One pocket had been stitched with a different shade of green. A single brass snap had been replaced by an ordinary hardware store button decades earlier. Nothing about it looked fashionable. Nothing about it looked expensive. And yet Arthur handled it with the kind of care most people reserved for family photographs. "Check it out," one of the young men said, angling his phone closer. "Grandpa's getting ready for Halloween." His friends burst into laughter. Another leaned forward, pointing toward the faded shoulder patch whose colors had almost disappeared beneath countless seasons of sun and rain. "That thing came from a bargain bin. Bet he paid $10 for the whole costume." Arthur slowly slipped one arm into the jacket without saying a word. His movements were unhurried, practiced, almost ceremonial. The old cotton settled across his shoulders as naturally as breathing. The room smelled faintly of canvas, machine oil, leather, and cedar from old storage shelves. Outside, pickup trucks rolled past beneath the bright Montana afternoon, but inside the surplus store time seemed strangely reluctant to move. The laughter grew louder because silence often encourages people who mistake kindness for weakness. "Hey, sir," another young man called. "Does that patch unlock secret missions or free coffee?" More laughter echoed through the aisles. Arthur adjusted the front zipper halfway before smoothing the fabric across his chest with weathered hands marked by age instead of jewelry. His pale blue eyes wandered toward the front window where sunlight spilled across dusty boots displayed beside an American flag that had faded almost as much as the jacket itself. He smiled, though not at the jokes. It was the quiet smile of someone remembering places no map could fully describe. "This old thing belongs in a museum," one of them scoffed. Arthur finally turned his head. His expression held neither anger nor embarrassment. It carried only the steady calm of a man who had long ago stopped measuring himself by strangers' opinions. "Maybe," he answered softly. "Or maybe it belongs exactly where someone still remembers what it means." The young men exchanged amused looks, convinced they had won some invisible contest. One stepped closer, reaching toward the shoulder with a careless grin. "Let's see what this fake patch even says." His fingertips hovered inches away from the faded stitching. Across the store, behind the register where receipts quietly printed and an old radio played forgotten country songs, the owner looked up for the first time that afternoon. The color slowly drained from his face as his eyes settled not on Arthur Bennett, but on the weathered patch sewn onto that battered field jacket. The young man let his fingers brush the faded shoulder patch with the casual confidence of someone who had never imagined that an old piece of fabric could matter. He squinted, then laughed. "You cannot even tell what this thing used to be. Looks like somebody stitched it together in a garage." His friends nodded, eager to keep the joke alive. One of them circled Arthur slowly, recording every angle with his phone. "You know what this needs?" he said. "A price tag. Maybe $20 if the zipper still works." Arthur remained perfectly still. He neither reached for the phone nor protested the insults. He simply rested one weathered hand against the front of the jacket, smoothing the fabric almost absent-mindedly as though protecting a memory instead of an object. "You boys collect old things?" he asked quietly. "Baseball cards? Old trucks? Vinyl records?" The tallest of the 3 shrugged with a grin. "Only if they are actually worth something." Arthur gave a faint smile. "Then you already understand more than you realize." The answer confused them for only a second before another round of laughter filled the narrow aisles. Behind the counter, Samuel Carter had stopped pretending to organize inventory. He stared at the patch from across the room without blinking. 30 years of owning a military surplus store had taught him to recognize uniforms from every generation, every branch, every forgotten corner of American service. Customers often brought in replicas, reproductions, and fantasy costumes hoping they had discovered hidden treasures in dusty attics. Samuel had learned to spot those within seconds. This jacket was different. Not because it looked valuable, but because it looked authentic in ways that could not be manufactured. The fading was uneven where sunlight naturally struck the shoulder over decades. The stitching had been repaired by hand using military thread that had not been produced for generations. Even the placement of the patch sat a fraction of an inch lower than modern regulations, exactly where field repairs often ended up after months away from any proper supply depot. Samuel slowly walked around the counter. Each step seemed heavier than the last. The young men barely noticed him. One reached toward the patch again. "Seriously, what is this supposed to be? Some secret club?" Arthur answered with the same calm voice. "No. Just a reminder." "Of what?" the young man asked. Arthur looked at the faded threads instead of the faces around him. "People who kept their promises." For reasons Samuel could not explain, those words sent a chill through him. He had heard stories like that long ago from veterans who rarely spoke about themselves but always remembered someone else. He stopped less than 6 feet away and adjusted his glasses. The patch was worn almost beyond recognition, yet beneath the faded embroidery he caught the outline of a shape he had not seen in more than 4 decades. His heartbeat quickened. He leaned slightly closer, careful not to invade Arthur's space. The store suddenly seemed quieter. Even the old country song playing through the speakers faded into the background. Samuel studied every thread, every stitch, every tiny imperfection left by time, and a memory buried deep beneath years of ordinary business slowly returned to the surface. His expression changed from curiosity to disbelief. Under his breath, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear, he whispered, "That cannot be real." Samuel Carter did not realize he was holding his breath until he slowly let it escape. His eyes remained fixed on the weathered patch while the rest of the room continued to exist somewhere beyond his attention. The faded threads were almost impossible to read, but the shape beneath them was unmistakable. Time had erased the colors. Sunlight had softened the fabric. Decades of careful wear had rounded every edge. Yet certain details refused to disappear. They had been sewn by hand, not by a factory machine. The border carried tiny irregular stitches that only appeared when a field repair had been done far away from any proper supply room. Samuel had seen thousands of military patches over the years. He had bought them from estate sales, museums, retired service members, and forgotten collections hidden inside dusty barns across Montana. He had never seen another one quite like this. One of the young men noticed the owner's expression and laughed. "What is it? You are not about to tell us this thing belongs in a museum too, are you?" Samuel did not answer immediately. He stepped closer, his movements slow enough that even Arthur quietly lifted his eyes toward him. For the first time since entering the store, the 2 older men looked directly at one another. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Samuel asked softly, "May I?" Arthur glanced at the patch for a moment before giving a small nod. Samuel carefully leaned in without touching the jacket. His glasses caught the overhead light as he studied every faded thread. There it was, barely visible beneath years of wear. A small hand-sewn mark hidden inside the lower edge of the border. His heart skipped. He had seen that exact stitch pattern once before in an old military archive nearly 40 years earlier while helping identify donated uniforms for a veterans museum. The memory returned with startling clarity. A retired supply sergeant had pointed toward a black and white photograph and quietly explained that certain teams repaired their own insignia in the field because replacements simply did not exist. The photographs had disappeared back into storage. The stories had never reached history books. Samuel slowly straightened. The laughter around him now sounded distant, almost meaningless. "Where did you get this jacket?" one of the young men asked Arthur with another grin. Arthur answered without hesitation. It has never belonged to anyone else. The words settled heavily inside the room. Samuel watched Arthur's face instead of the jacket now. There was no pride in the old man's voice. No attempt to impress anyone. Only simple truths spoken without expectation. That honesty convinced Samuel more than the patch ever could. Replicas came with dramatic stories. Real veterans usually answered with the fewest words possible. Samuel quietly reached beneath the counter and opened a worn wooden drawer that customers had never noticed before. Inside rested an old leather notebook filled with handwritten notes, faded photographs, and sketches collected over decades. His fingers carefully turned page after page until he reached a section marked only by a brittle bookmark. His eyes moved between the notebook and Arthur's shoulder. Every comparison tightened the knot in his chest. The stitching matched. The proportions matched. Even the placement matched. Samuel closed the notebook with trembling hands. Without another word, he reached into his pocket, removed his phone, and walked toward the small office behind the register. As the office door quietly clicked shut behind him, the young men laughed again, believing the old store owner had simply gone to avoid an awkward conversation. Arthur remained exactly where he stood, gently resting one hand against the faded field jacket, while behind the closed door Samuel searched for a phone number he had not called in more than 20 years. Samuel closed the office door until only a narrow strip of light remained beneath it. The sounds of laughter outside became muffled, replaced by the quiet ticking of an old wall clock that had hung there since the store first opened. His fingers hovered above the worn keypad of his phone before stopping. For a long moment he simply stared at the number stored under a name he had never expected to call again. Outside, Arthur Bennett stood patiently beside the rack of field jackets, his attention drifting toward the rows of faded canvas packs and dented canteens that lined the shelves. They were ordinary objects to most people. To him they carried the familiar scent of canvas warmed by countless summers, machine oil soaked deep into old stitching, and cedar from decades of careful storage. His fingertips rested lightly on the shoulder patch. The rough texture beneath his hand awakened a memory that had never truly faded. The surplus store slowly disappeared. The bright Montana afternoon dissolved into the soft gray light of another morning many years earlier. Damp mountain air settled over a small temporary camp hidden beneath towering pine trees. No one spoke louder than necessary. Boots pressed quietly into the earth while a handful of exhausted young soldiers prepared for another assignment that would never appear in newspapers or history books. Arthur was barely 20 years old. His field jacket was still new then, the fabric stiff and the sleeves uncreased. A friend sat beside him on an overturned wooden crate holding a needle threaded with olive drab string. The man smiled without looking up as he carefully stitched a freshly made patch onto Arthur's shoulder by hand. The supply office never got the official version, he said with a quiet laugh. So I made this one myself. Arthur watched the careful movements of the needle. It is crooked, he replied. Everything worth remembering usually is, his friend answered. Around them the camp remained calm. Someone quietly heated coffee over a small stove. Another checked maps spread across a weathered table. Wind moved gently through the tall trees above, carrying the clean scent of pine instead of fear. Before standing, Arthur's friend rested one hand on the newly sewn patch. Someday the colors will fade, he said. The thread will wear out. People will stop recognizing it. Arthur looked down at the fresh stitching. Then why wear it? The answer came without hesitation. Because somebody who was there will know. The memory lingered on the sound of quiet laughter shared between friends before the morning carried each of them toward different responsibilities. There were no speeches. No promises of glory. Only simple trust earned through long days and longer nights. The memory dissolved as gently as it had arrived. Arthur found himself once again standing inside the surplus store with his hands still resting against the faded patch. His expression never changed, but his eyes held the warmth of someone remembering voices that time could never completely erase. Inside the office, Samuel finally pressed the call button. The line rang once. Then twice. A steady voice answered. "This is Colonel Richard Hayes." Samuel swallowed carefully before speaking. "Colonel, my name is Samuel Carter. I own Carter Military Surplus in Bozeman. I believe there is an old veteran standing in my store wearing a field jacket with a patch that should not exist anymore." Silence filled the line. Then the colonel asked one question, his voice suddenly sharper than before. "Tell me the name sewn into that jacket." Samuel looked through the office window toward Arthur Bennett before answering. "The name is Arthur Bennett," he said quietly. The silence on the other end lasted several long seconds. Colonel Richard Hayes did not ask Samuel to repeat it. He simply inhaled slowly, as though a forgotten page of history had just reopened. "How old would you estimate he is?" the colonel asked. "Mid-80s," Samuel replied. "He is standing here wearing a faded field jacket with a hand-stitched shoulder patch that matches an archived photograph I saw decades ago." Papers shifted faintly through the telephone speaker. Samuel imagined the colonel searching through memories rather than files. "Listen carefully," Colonel Hayes finally said. "Do not ask him unnecessary questions. Do not make him uncomfortable. Most importantly, do not let him leave if he is willing to stay." Samuel nodded instinctively even though the colonel could not see him. "Am I looking at something genuine?" he asked. The answer came without hesitation. "If the patch is what you believe it is, then you are looking at someone very few people are still alive to recognize." The call ended with a promise that someone would contact him within minutes. Samuel lowered the phone but did not put it away. Before he could collect his thoughts, it vibrated again. A new number appeared on the screen. "This is Sergeant Major Thomas Whitaker," the deep voice announced. "Colonel Hayes briefed me. Describe the patch." Samuel carefully explained every faded detail, every hand-sewn stitch, every worn edge that time had failed to erase. The sergeant major interrupted only once. "Does the lower border have an uneven repair that curves slightly upward?" Samuel felt a chill travel through his shoulders. "Yes," he answered. "Exactly." Another pause followed. "Then there is no mistake." The line became quiet before the sergeant major spoke again, this time with unmistakable respect. "I never thought I would hear about one of those jackets outside official archives." Samuel glanced through the office window once more. Arthur had not moved. The three young men continued talking among themselves, convinced they had become the center of attention. One of them casually laughed while scrolling through the video he had recorded moments earlier. None of them noticed the invisible change that had settled over the room. Samuel did. The store no longer felt like an ordinary business. It felt like a place quietly waiting for history to walk through its front door. His phone rang for a third time. The caller identified himself as Brigadier General Daniel Harrington's executive aide. Samuel straightened instinctively. "Mr. Carter," the aide said politely, "General Harrington has been informed. He would like one confirmation before he departs." Samuel swallowed. "What does he need?" "Ask Mr. Bennett one question exactly as I say it. Do not explain why. Simply ask whether the jacket still carries the original stitching beneath the shoulder seam." Samuel thanked him and stepped back into the store. The laughter faded as everyone noticed the seriousness on his face. Arthur looked toward him with quiet patience, as though he had already guessed what was coming. Samuel approached slowly and stopped a respectful distance away. "Mr. Bennett," he said gently, "I apologize for asking, but does that jacket still have the original stitching beneath the left shoulder seam?" Arthur smiled almost imperceptibly. Without a single dramatic gesture, he lifted the inside lining just enough to reveal a row of carefully repaired stitches hidden beneath the fabric. "It has never been replaced," he answered softly. Samuel closed his eyes for one brief moment. When he opened them again, every remaining doubt had disappeared. He quietly slipped his phone back into his pocket, looked directly at Arthur, and spoke with a respect that had not existed only minutes earlier. "Sir," he said, "I believe someone very important is already on the way to see you." Arthur Bennett looked at Samuel Carter with the same quiet expression he had worn since walking into the store. There was no surprise in his face, only the patient calm of a man who had lived long enough to understand that unexpected moments often arrived without warning. "Someone important?" Arthur asked with a gentle smile. "I believe everyone is important, son." Samuel lowered his eyes respectfully. "You know that is not what I meant, sir." Arthur gave a small nod but said nothing more. Around them the atmosphere had shifted in ways the three young men could not explain. Their laughter had faded into uncertain whispers. The tallest among them slipped his phone into his pocket, suddenly uncomfortable with the silence that now filled the aisles. "What is going on?" he finally asked. "Did we miss something?" Samuel answered politely without taking his eyes off Arthur. "I think all of us are about to learn something." Outside, a steady breeze pushed dust across the parking lot beneath a bright Montana sky. A weathered American flag near the entrance moved gently above rows of parked pickup trucks. Inside the store, the old country song ended, leaving only the soft hum of the lights and the faint ticking of a clock near the register. Arthur slowly walked toward a display of vintage camping equipment. He paused beside an old metal canteen and smiled as though greeting an old friend. "They do not make them like this anymore," he said quietly. Samuel joined him. "Neither the canteens," he replied, "nor the men who carried them." Arthur chuckled softly but did not respond. His silence carried more weight than most conversations. Samuel's phone vibrated again. He stepped a few feet away before answering. The familiar voice of Colonel Richard Hayes came through immediately. "Mr. Carter, I have confirmation. Brigadier General Daniel Harrington is already on his way from Helena. Estimated arrival is less than 30 minutes. Samuel glanced toward the front windows. "Should I tell Mr. Bennett?" "Only if he asks," the colonel replied. "One more thing." Samuel listened carefully. "The general asked me to remind you that if this is indeed Arthur Bennett, today is not about proving who he is. It is about showing him the respect that time never diminished." The call ended, leaving Samuel standing quietly beside the register. He looked across the room and noticed the young men watching Arthur differently now. Their confidence had begun to crack beneath simple uncertainty. One of them cleared his throat before cautiously approaching Arthur. "Sir," he said, no longer smiling, "I guess we were just joking around." Arthur turned toward him with kind eyes. "I know." The young man hesitated. "You are not upset?" Arthur gently shook his head. "People usually laugh at what they do not understand. That is not the worst mistake someone can make. Refusing to learn after the laughter stops is much worse." The words landed with unexpected force. None of the three had an answer. They simply stood quietly while the old veteran adjusted the cuff of his weathered jacket. Minutes passed. Every vehicle that drove past the storefront pulled their attention toward the parking lot before continuing down the highway. Then, in the distance, several dark government vehicles appeared together, moving steadily beneath the afternoon sun. They were not traveling fast. They did not use flashing lights or sirens. Their quiet arrival somehow commanded even greater attention. Samuel recognized the lead vehicle immediately. He inhaled slowly, straightened his posture without thinking, and whispered almost to himself, "They are here." Arthur remained completely still, one hand resting lightly against the faded shoulder patch that had carried its story through decades of silence, as the convoy turned into the parking lot and rolled to a gentle stop outside the surplus store. The engines fell silent one by one until the parking lot was wrapped in an almost unnatural stillness. Every conversation inside the surplus store stopped without anyone asking for silence. Even the three young men who had spent the last several minutes laughing found themselves staring through the front windows. The doors of the lead vehicle opened first. A uniformed aide stepped out, followed by a tall man with silver hair beneath his service cap. His movements were calm, measured, and completely without ceremony. Brigadier General Daniel Harrington did not scan the shelves or acknowledge the curious faces waiting inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, his eyes settled on Arthur Bennett. Samuel Carter quietly stepped aside. No introduction seemed necessary anymore. The general walked across the worn wooden floor at an unhurried pace. His polished shoes echoed softly through the store, each step blending with the gentle creak of old floorboards that had supported generations of veterans searching for familiar pieces of their past. Arthur remained where he was, one hand resting lightly against the faded shoulder patch. His expression carried the same quiet warmth it always had, as though he were greeting another ordinary customer. When the two men finally stood a few feet apart, either spoke immediately. The general looked first at Arthur's face, then at the weathered field jacket, then back again. His eyes lingered on the faded stitching beneath the shoulder seam exactly where Samuel had described it. A faint smile crossed his face, not because he was pleased, but because something long hoped for had finally become real. Without warning, Brigadier General Daniel Harrington came to full attention. His posture was flawless. Every person inside the store instinctively straightened as though they understood they were witnessing something deeply significant. The general slowly raised his right hand in a formal salute. No words accompanied the gesture. No explanation followed. It was offered with complete sincerity and unmistakable respect. The room became so quiet that the ticking clock near the register seemed louder than ever before. Arthur looked at the general for several seconds before gently returning the salute with the same calm precision that countless years had never erased from memory. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange there was recognition that needed no audience and no applause. The three young men stared in disbelief. One quietly lowered his head. Another slipped his phone completely out of sight. None of them had imagined that the elderly man they had mocked only minutes earlier would be greeted by a general with such unmistakable honor. The salute ended. Brigadier General Harrington lowered his hand before speaking in a voice filled with quiet gratitude. "Mr. Bennett, I have hoped for many years that our paths might cross." Arthur smiled gently. "Life has a way of surprising people." The general nodded. "Yes, sir. It certainly does." Samuel watched with emotion he could barely contain. Throughout decades of meeting veterans from every branch of service, he had never witnessed a moment like this. There was no ceremony prepared. No cameras from television stations. No official stage. Only an old surplus store, a faded field jacket, and a respect so genuine that it transformed the entire room. The general glanced briefly toward the three young men. He offered them no criticism and no angry look. Instead, he turned back to Arthur and quietly said, "There are stories attached to that patch that many people have forgotten, but there are still a few of us who remember exactly what it represents, and today it is my privilege to thank the man who carried it with such dignity for all these years. Arthur." Bennett lowered his hand after returning the salute, and for several quiet seconds no one in the surplus store seemed willing to disturb the silence that had settled over the room. Brigadier General Daniel Harrington looked at the faded shoulder patch once more before speaking. "Most people see worn fabric," he said softly. "I see a promise that survived longer than many official records." Arthur glanced down at the jacket and gently brushed a thumb across the uneven stitching. "The thread has held up better than I expected," he replied with a faint smile. The general smiled in return. "Because someone cared enough to sew it correctly the first time." Samuel Carter listened with growing amazement. He had spent years collecting uniforms, medals, and forgotten pieces of military history, yet he had never heard anyone speak about a simple patch with such quiet reverence. One of the young men finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been building in everyone's mind. "Sir," he said respectfully, looking at the general, "what makes that patch so special?" Brigadier General Harrington turned toward him without the slightest hint of anger. "It is special because it was never designed to impress anyone," he answered. "It was created so that a very small number of people could recognize one another after years had passed. It was never sold. It was never issued through ordinary supply channels. Every one of them was sewn by hand, and every stitch represented trust rather than rank." The young man slowly nodded, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine curiosity. "So it belongs to a special unit?" The general paused before answering. "It belongs to a chapter of service that was intentionally kept quiet. Many details remain private, not because they are mysterious, but because the people involved believed the work itself mattered more than recognition. Arthur looked toward the front window where the afternoon sunlight rested across the parking lot. Most of the men who wore one are gone now, he said quietly. That is why I never expected anyone to recognize it. Samuel felt a lump rise in his throat. But someone remembered, he said. Arthur smiled. Someone always does. Brigadier General Harrington reached into the inside pocket of his dress coat and carefully removed a small leather folder embossed with the seal of the Department of the Army. He opened it with deliberate care before holding it where Arthur could see. Inside rested a single photograph protected beneath a clear sleeve. It showed a group of young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder beneath tall pine trees many decades earlier. Time had faded the black and white image, but one figure near the center wore a freshly sewn shoulder patch in exactly the same position. Arthur studied the photograph for several long moments. His smile grew warmer. William took that picture, he said almost to himself. He carried that camera everywhere. The general nodded. The photograph was preserved in an archive. Your name was never printed beneath it, but the stitching on your shoulder was unmistakable. Arthur looked down at his jacket once more. William always said that patch would outlive all of us. The general carefully closed the folder. In a way, he was right. It carried your story until someone who understood it could finally say thank you. The three young men stood silently, no longer seeing an old jacket or faded fabric. They now saw a lifetime of quiet service woven into every worn thread, and they understood that respect is often earned long before strangers ever learn the reason for it. No one hurried to leave. The surplus store, which had begun the afternoon with laughter, now held a silence that felt almost sacred. Sunlight stretched across the worn wooden floor as Brigadier General Daniel Harrington carefully returned the leather folder to his coat. He looked at Arthur Bennett with quiet admiration before speaking once more. Mr. Bennett, there will be a memorial gathering next month honoring a generation whose service shaped far more than most Americans will ever know. It would mean a great deal if you would allow us to recognize you there. Arthur looked down at the faded field jacket resting comfortably on his shoulders. His fingertips paused over the weathered patch, tracing the uneven stitches with the familiarity of someone greeting an old friend. He smiled gently before answering. I appreciate the invitation, General, but if I come, I would rather people remember the men who are no longer able to stand beside me. The general lowered his head in quiet respect. That is exactly why we hope you will be there. Samuel Carter watched the exchange with grateful eyes. For decades he had filled his store with relics from American history, believing that every worn piece of equipment carried a story worth preserving. Today he realized that the greatest stories had never been displayed on shelves at all. They had quietly walked through his front door wearing ordinary clothes and expecting nothing from anyone. One of the young men slowly stepped forward. His voice was almost hesitant. Mr. Bennett, he said, I owe you an apology. Arthur turned toward him with the same calm expression that had never changed throughout the afternoon. You do not owe me anything, he replied. The young man shook his head. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I thought that jacket was just old fabric. Arthur smiled warmly. Most people see what is on the outside first. Age teaches you to look a little deeper. The young man nodded. I will remember that. Arthur gently placed a hand on the young man's shoulder for only a moment. That is enough for me. Outside, the breeze lifted the edge of the American flag once again. The late afternoon light painted long shadows across the parking lot as the government vehicles waited quietly without urgency. There was no celebration, no applause, and no crowd gathering around the store. The most meaningful moments often happened without an audience. Brigadier General Harrington extended his hand. Arthur accepted it with a firm but gentle grip. Thank you for carrying that patch all these years, the general said. Arthur looked toward the distant mountains beyond the front window. I was never carrying it for myself, he answered. Every stitch reminds me of someone who deserved to come home and tell his own stories. Since many of them cannot, I suppose I have carried a few memories for them. No one spoke after that. Words no longer seemed necessary. Samuel quietly opened the front door as Arthur stepped outside beneath the wide Montana sky. The general walked beside him, not ahead of him. The three young men remained near the entrance, watching with new understanding as the old veteran disappeared into the warm afternoon light wearing the same faded field jacket that had never asked to be admired, only remembered. Long after the vehicles had disappeared down the highway, the surplus store felt different. The shelves still held old uniforms, worn boots, and weathered packs, but everyone inside understood that the greatest measure of a life could never be found in how new something looked. It lived instead in the character quietly woven into every choice, every promise kept, and every humble act of service that asked for no recognition. Some uniforms fade with time. Honor never does.